So, David, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Okay, nice. Let me introduce you. But before introducing you, I would like also to share with the audience that our first contact with David happened a few years ago via email. And I think it was in 2020 or in 2021 when I was doing my master's thesis. And I'm truly glad that today we finally have the chance to welcome David to our conference, to our event. And it's really a pleasure to see this moment come to life. And please, listeners, join me in warmly welcoming David Nibert. Professor David Nibert is a scholar, activist who teaches courses on animals and society, global injustice, the sociology of law, and social stratification. He has worked as a tenant organizer, as a community activist, and in the prevention of mistreatment and violence against deviated groups. He has contributed chapters to numerous anthologies and is the author of several books, such as Animal Oppression and Human Violence, um, Animal Rights, Human Rights, and Hitting the Lottery Jackpot. He also edited a two-volume work titled Animal Oppression and Capitalism. And today's topic of David's speech is US Cold War policy and the entangled oppression of humans and other animals. So, David, do you have any PowerPoint slides to share with us?
Yes.
Okay, let's try to share it. Can you?
Okay, let's see here.
Does it work? Yeah, you have a permission to share with us.
Okay. Well, sorry for the glitch here. So I'm hitting share screen. Let's see. Does that show up?
Unfortunately, no.
No.
Uh, Yana, can you check that David has a permission to share?
Um, yeah, it should work. So I think
Okay.
like several participants can demonstrate the screen, but if it doesn't work, then maybe some of us can share or.
Sorry for the glitch here. So you say there may be an alternative way if I email the presentation to
Yeah,
somebody?
yeah.
Okay, so I'm sorry for this,
No
folks.
problems. No
Let's
problems.
bear with me 1 minute. Mark, I'll try to send this to you. Okay.
Okay, okay. Via Zoom or via our email?
Okay, Mark, I tried to send it to the email that I received from you. So let's see if that shows up.
Unfortunately, I can't see any new emails. Ah, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, in the meantime, my apologies, folks. and while Mark's trying to retrieve that, well, greetings from Ohio in the USA, the heart of the empire, sitting here on stolen land. Actually, the Ohio Territory with the newly established United States, the first military operation was to displace and kill indigenous peoples right here where I am. So anyway, greetings from the empire, and thanks to everybody for this amazing work you've done to bring this conference together. And it's an honor to be included in such an important event. And I'm very I apologize for my own lack of language skills, and I wasn't able to comprehend the previous presentation that looked amazing, and I was hoping to learn from it. A lot of us, my work and a lot of us, we've focused on the capitalist system, and we all know the likes of McDonald's and all these nefarious slaughter culture companies and all the harm that they do. But in this particular presentation, I wanted to pull back a bit and look at capitalism in the context of global affairs, and especially U.S. foreign policy and the enormous impact it's had on the world. And that includes other animals. So while this presentation may look like at some point I'm losing sight of the other animals, I'll be bringing them back to the center again, because you have to understand what's happened to the members of our species around the world to clearly understand what's happening to the other inhabitants of the planet. So I guess we're ready to go on to the next slide, Mark. Thank you for your assistance here. Okay, could you back up 1 second just to this project, like many of my projects, is somewhat overly ambitious. And I've got a lot of slides here, and we may move through them more rapidly than you'd like, but if anybody would want a copy of this, I can just let me know and I can email it to you. My email address is there. And if anybody is interested, if anybody has any time to point out my typos, misspellings, and grammatical errors, I always appreciate that. Okay, I think we're ready to move on, Mark. Thanks. Okay, we're losing the bottom. I don't suppose there's anything we can do to, at least on my screen. Can you see to the end of the slide on your side?
Yes, I can see.
Okay, good. Okay, so the points I'm trying to make is, of course, critical animal studies is all about how the oppression of humans and other animals is deeply entangled and especially connected to the capitalist system. And then coming into this presentation, in the U.S., for the past century and a half, there's been profound vilification of socialism and communism, and that led to the destructive Cold War. And that was undertaken on the part of the United States, basically to suppress any constraints to the expanding ability of capitalists, especially U.S. capitalists, to gain profits. So humans and other animals have been profoundly affected by U.S. Cold War policies, politically, economically, and ideologically. And then I continue to make the point that a transition to a form of a socialist/communist system is the way forward. So Next. Okay, first of all, just a little bit of review of some of your work and my work, how the U.S. became the empire. Next. Okay, so when the North America was invaded, first there was a massive killing of free-living other animals that served to fuel the quote-unquote fur trade undertaken for profit, and the indigenous peoples were pulled into the global capitalist systems. Then there were all the profits derived from the displacement of indigenous peoples right here in Ohio and elsewhere for ranching. And then the U.S. then went on to invade Mexico and take half of Mexico's land. And then there was an enormous amount of wealth in the United States that was acquired through the ruthless ongoing oppression of the people who were enslaved, and then by the unrelenting exploitation of workers. Next. So all of this oppression, of course, is promoted for economic gain. It's enabled by the oppressor's control of the state, and it's justified and rationalized by nefarious ideologies that are all entangled in it throughout American history, and now coming into the present tends to be embodied in social Darwinism. So in the United States, the attempt of people in Paris in 1871 through the Paris Commune to try to organize and create a different system, that was very concerning for capitalists in the United States. And then when the Communist Manifesto made its way here, they were very concerned. So they began at that time to disparage labor organizers and attempts of workers to strike by claiming that these were communists, that were attempting to undermine the way of life in the United States. And communism began at that time to become a profound, slanderous term. Next. So after the U.S., they take indigenous lands, they invade Mexico. Then the United States provokes a war with Spain for the purpose of taking Spain's colonies. And the people in the Philippines who were struggling for their own independence against the Spanish, then they had to turn their struggle against the United States that had no intention of liberating any of the people in these colonies that they acquired. And the whole purpose of this policy, and of course, the U.S. waged deadly war on the people of the Philippines. And the whole purpose of that is reflected, in announcements from the U.S. Senate floor that basically, for the United States to grow, that the commerce of the world needs to be laid at the doorstep by the United States. So anyway, and all of this is justified by suggesting that the people of Philippines, as people of color everywhere, were more akin to other animals. Thanks. Next. Okay, so the U.S. is very blatant about it, and here's the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, and it just lays it out, right? There's no need for any explanation or justification other than, we have the power and we're going to do it. This is U.S. foreign policy, right? It's just self-serving, violent, and this is capitalism in motion. Next. So as this is going on within the United States and other parts of the world, this continued growth of domestication are these other animals being crowded into the land, stolen from indigenous peoples, dispatched to slaughterhouses. And again, the people who are working there doing that horrible work disproportionately are oppressed. Immigrants to the United States, the work is dangerous, it's hellish. And then that those work situations are mirrored in the living quarters that they're relegated to. And there's a lot of entangled oppression, especially when you look at the people who are working in factories, working with the skin and hair of other animals. It's just a hideous time in the United States and Britain and elsewhere. And, Dickens writes about this at length in his own work. So So the wealth created in the United States is coming at the expense of other animals. It's coming at the expense of their entangled oppression with people, workers in the United States, that's entangled with indigenous peoples and with the peoples around the world as the U.S. continues to now move from colonization to imperialism. Next. So people are resisting in the United States. Young women working in textile mills in New England. The Socialist Party begins to emerge in the United States. There are a few labor unions, but they tend to be fairly restrictive, and they just confine themselves to skilled workers. So we see the emergence of the industrial workers of the world, embracing all workers, and they made some progress politically. By 1918, the Socialist Party had won hundreds of offices in cities and states around the country. So they were making progress. Next. And at this time, there was even some advocacy for other animals. And Christianity at that point in the United States tended to be dominated somewhat by what was called the social gospel movement, and that the religious leaders thought that they should be concerned with serving their fellow humans. And we even began to see the rise within that movement of concern for other animals. We also saw women in the United States and Britain, for example, working to try to undermine the growth and the purchase of colorful feathered hats that came at such deadly expense of other birds. And we have other women, including Frances Cobb, who helped organize the National Anti-Vivisectionist Society. So we began to see early movement for the other animals at this time. Next. And this is just a few pictures from Ida Tarbell, who organized against the mass lynching of people of color in the United States. Eugene Debs, a profound American socialist. Mother Jones, great labor organizer. Big Bill Hayward, one of the leaders of the industrial workers of the world. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, socialist, anarchist, labor organizer. The powerful W.E.B. Du Bois in his own work, organizing, educating, and his embrace of socialism and communism. Next. And world wars always have the effect of dampening dissent within the country, and that happened in the United States. But everyone wasn't quieted. Du Bois denounced the war for what it was, powerful capitalist countries, grabbing for global resources. The U.S., began to lock up people speaking out against the war, and this deadly war that killed millions of humans, and then who knows how many other animals, but there was some count of other animals who were drafted into the war, who also died by the millions. So war is horrible for humans and other animals simply from this perspective, from this simply massive destruction. Next. Okay, so now anti-communism within the United States. Next, Mark, thank you. Okay, so there's the revolution in Russia that you all are probably much more informed about this than I am. But this revolution in Russia was hobbled from the start because the powerful capitalist countries led by the United States tried to fund the civil war in Russia to take down the new Soviet state, and then the United States and other capitalist countries waged war, actual war against the new Soviet Union, as you all know, and then they retreated from those direct militaristic assaults into the Cold War. Next. Okay, so a lot of people in the United States and around the world, they are inspired by the Russian Revolution. So as a result of this growing embrace of socialism in the United States, especially the the gains that they made politically, the United States basically criminalized it. They began even though it was illegal, it doesn't make any difference then or now, actually, the repression going on. But anyway, so they waged war against socialists and communists and labor organizers and people working for justice. And they began to engineer the fear of communism. And they even began to represent efforts for Black justice and liberation as being communist inspired, which facilitated, amongst other things, not just police violence against Blacks in the United States, but also, community riots, that in some cases destroyed entire Black communities. Again, justified in part that they were communist inspired. Next. Okay, so here's a quote from Michael Parenti that basically sums up briefly, what happened. Socialism in the United States was repressively, violently suppressed. Did everything they could to take them down, and within a few years, they were basically, pushed into the shadows. Next. And then U.S. imperialism continues. United States is already deeply involved in exploitation and plundering in Central and South America. And just by way of example, looking at Haiti, they were totally plundered by the United States and then occupied in the early part of the 20th century. And I thought this quote by Langston Hughes is particularly poignant. Capitalism in motion. This is U.S. foreign policy. Again, economically motivated. The oppressors have they have power of the state. And again, this is justified with racism and animalization. Next. And this is, you probably haven't heard of this U.S. military general, Smedley Butler, and he was involved in a great deal of this. But then in 1935, he came out and basically denounced what he had done and what the United States was about, calling himself a gangster for capitalism. And this is exactly what it was. And this didn't stop then. This continues. And again, if I move it a little bit too quickly, anybody that wants this to read this in more detail, I'd be more than happy to send it to you. Next. Okay, so, and then within the United States, the capitalists are concerned, they've got a bad reputation. The social gospel movement is a thorn in their side. So they decide to recruit and to co-opt a segment of U.S. Christianity to serve their interests. So these powerful economic interests basically promoted clergy in the United States to promote capitalism and to denounce godless communism. And this evolving conservative evangelical movement in the United States, very conservative, anti-communist, anti-New Deal, patriarchal, classist, militarist, and it remains so pretty much to this day. Next. Just one person in particular, Billy Graham, who basically he became their, they just loved Billy Graham and him stoking, not just in the United States, but around the world, this idea that communists were in league with the devil. And he was quickly embraced and propped up and promoted by some of the wealthiest people in the country. Again, creating mass hysteria propaganda in the United States, and most people are susceptible to this. Next. World War II, again, a lot of people were clamoring for change with the Great Depression occurred in the United States in the 1930s, and the movement was growing again for social transformation. But World War II refocused, as wars tend to do. And of course, this was a fight against fascism in Europe, but a lot of that fascism in Europe, a lot of their ideals, and values reflected those of capitalists in the United States. But when it looked like U.S. capitalists may be put in the back seat by this movement, then that's when they decided to get into the war. Other animals continue to be, just massively moved through slaughterhouses, and eating their flesh has always been highlighted as a essential factor in manly growth and behavior. And of course, that was promoted within the United States, especially during that time. Again, so much death and destruction. Again, and this includes other animals. Who knows how many animals are killed around the world from this horrible conflict. But then the U.S. develops these horrible nuclear weapons that they test on thousands of other animals, and they drop those in Japan, killing roughly 250,000 people and countless other animals. And that was after they did those nuclear bombings, after massive firebombing across Japan. Again, all of this pro-capitalist fighting each other war, horrible for humans, horrible for other animals. And one of the reasons the U.S. dropped those atomic bombs, some scholars believe, is to send a message to the Soviet Union of the power of the United States. Next. Anyway, this is a great quote from Roxanne Ortiz about the what happened to the rest of the war after World War II, the rest of the world. Next. Not to let the global the Cold War and U.S. domination, a lot of this is focused on violence, but the U.S. at this time were also to develop these powerful economic tools of domination for the World Bank and IMF that have been used as methods to exploit and oppress peoples of the world. And of course, they were joined toward the end of the 20th century with the World Trade Organization, and they all continue to function pretty much as powerful tools of exploitation by the United States and their junior global capitalist partners. Next. Okay, so after World War II, the United States, a lot of people in the United States thinks, especially some of my students, thinks that World War II, the U.S. was fighting the Soviet Union, not knowing that the Soviet Union was the U.S. ally during that period. Of course, the U.S. didn't welcome that, and as soon as the war was over, then they launched back into this anti-communist propaganda and foreign policy, again, because the U.S. does not want any alternative to global capitalist expansion. And the Soviet Union stood as a possible obstacle and as a possible option for so many peoples of the world. So communist hysteria was promoted throughout the United States, and the people who stood up to denounce it, including Henry Wallace, who was vice president of Roosevelt during his first administration, he called for peace and cooperation with the Soviet Union, and he was fired by Truman immediately. Other people in the United States calling for peace and cooperation with the Soviet Union were harassed and made to stand before congressional committees, who were denouncing communism in the United States. Next. After World War II, so many people in these formerly colonized parts of the world became independent after World War II. And again, they were dreaming of alternative societies that they could create for themselves and for their children and people of their community going into the future. And President Truman came out and said the U.S. is going to get thoroughly behind, trying to contain, if not destroy, the growth of communism and socialism around the world. Next. Those congressional committees, there was one in the House, but also one in the U.S. Senate that you probably know about, led by Eugene McCarthy, and they went after not just people in the government, but they went after colleges and universities. And then, of course, we see echoes of that going on right now within the United States. Again, part and parcel of this total propaganda war undertaken here within the United States, and with a great deal of effect. Next. And then the United States begins then to use military force. After World War II, people in Korea, they wanted to go toward their own styled communist system. People in the United States know little about this war, but the United States undertook this drastic, horrible destruction of Korea. And then after they were done almost thoroughly bombing Korea, almost most of the other animals were destroyed. And it was actually Chinese, People's Army of China that actually pushed the United States out of North Korea. Anyway, all of this death and destruction undertaken to try to counter people in other parts of the world, in this case Korea, wanting to pursue their system they wanted. And of course, that gets in the way with U.S. capitalist expansion. And of course, this is denounced within the United States and supported. People believe that the communists who are in league with the devil are trying to take over the world. And no, these are simply people in Korea wanting self-determination, and they wanted a system that was a more peaceful, respectful, just system as opposed to capitalism. Next. That destruction motivated Picasso in this particular image. Next. CIA got behind a coup in Iran, threw out a democratically elected leader because he wanted to nationalize the oil industry. They justified it by he was going communist. They put a deadly dictator in office that suppressed people's voices and dissent in Iran till the late 1970s. Again, justified by the Cold War. Next. People after World War II came together in Indonesia with this amazing conference, this Bandung conference in Indonesia, and they were pulling together, saying, we don't want any part of this Cold War. We want to move forward collectively, and we want to do that peacefully. And this is a wonderful moment in history, but capitalists in the United States and many in Europe was horrified by this. Next. Here's some of the speakers. By the way, in this so-called Cold War, you had leaders of China calling for cooperation and peace with the United States. You had Khrushchev in the United States in 1959 calling for peace and the laying down of weapons. Next. And this is how it was portrayed in the United States by the U.S. Secretary of State, a devious ploy. And then it's very interesting to note what Dulles later penned. Again, clearly, sometimes the truth comes out. This is manipulation of people. Next. U.S. war on Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh, the people in Vietnam after World War II, they worked with the United States in pushing the Japanese out. They wanted their independence. They appealed to the United States. They talked about they could collaborate in trade and other affairs. They were ignored. U.S. agreed with France that the U.S. would support the France recolonization of Vietnam, but the French would help the United States in repressing the movements for communism in Europe, where a lot of the resistance in Europe against the Nazis were led in countries like France and Italy by communists, and they were valued and supported at the time. And the U.S., moved to repress that. Next. Again, all of this war in Vietnam, and it led into Laos and Cambodia. And again, we have now a glimpse of the U.S. Cold War and all this violence against people around the world who want self-determination and they want to move in a different way as opposed to capitalism, and this horrible destruction of humans and other animals. Next. Thank you, Mark. And just looking at Vietnam, the impact on all of these other animals there. In the United States, Dr. King, when he came out in 1967, denouncing the Vietnam War, plus denouncing U.S. Similar foreign policies around the world, he was denounced by the media. He was even a lot of people within the civil rights movement turned their back on him, said that he was getting off point. But King, in that amazing speech, he talked at length why he was compelled to do that. But of course, people in the United States have no idea that King made this statement back in 1967. It was true then, and it's true today. Next. Thank you, Mark. Okay, the Kennedy administration, his own Cold War program. You know, there's a revolution in Cuba when people rose up against the U.S. colonization and plundering there. So Kennedy created this so-called economic program to try to tether people in Central America more closely to the United States. And a good part of that, as I and others have written about, was about the expansion of the ranching of domesticated other animals in Latin America, which again led to more displacement and people pushing back against their expropriation of their lands. And then, of course, these people themselves had to be violently repressed. Next. So the U.S., and there's so much to talk about, right? You can't squeeze it into one presentation, but the U.S. is now just pressing this horrific, violent foreign policy, in this case, throughout Central and South America. One of the most known of their horrific interventions was in Chile in 1973, with supporting the deadly coup there and repression and pushing General Pinochet into power. And again, all of this, people in these countries are still laboring under the effects of this to this day. In many cases, all their hopes for self-determination and justice, are continue to be denied by the presence of U.S.-backed leaders. Even though there have been some efforts, especially in South America, to push back in Venezuela and Bolivia, the U.S. still exerts firm control there. Next. Oh, by the way, South America, I mean, the U.S.-backed dictators there cooperated, and any professors, activists, socialists, communists trying to flee violent death into adjacent countries were relentlessly pursued and killed. Again, backed and supported by the United States. Next. A lot of the repression in South America, these countries that U.S. controlled, they had military officers trained at the School of the Americas, where they were trained in CIA created torture techniques, and there's just this horrible state terrorism, pervasive throughout South America at the time. Again, promoted by the U.S. to smash any efforts to contain the ongoing expansion of capitalism. Next. And of course, in the 1960s, then we see the oppression of the Palestinians increasing, but in 1967, the Israeli state called the attention of the U.S. military, who thought the Israeli state, appropriately armed, could be a very powerful junior partner in that part of the world. And we see, by the way, Joe Biden, who many called Butcher Joe when he was in office, in part because of his promoting the proxy war in Ukraine and the genocide in Gaza, said if it wasn't in Israel, we'd have to create one, right? Because they need that junior partner in that part of the world. Next. Thank you, Mark. And of course, so much death and destruction in Africa. U.S. long supported the apartheid racist system in South Africa, so long as the South African government helped to repress socialist movements, communist movements, and in Africa, especially in Angola and Rhodesia. Again, long, deadly war killing so many people, so many other animals. And again, they still feel the effects of that. Next. Again, this went on around Africa. And I thought when the British were repressing attempts at independence of people in Kenya, they also alleged that that was because they were communist inspired. But I thought this quote by someone who went into the Kenya forest and noted the effect of this warfare on the other animals there. I mean, we can't imagine what similar commentators would have said in other parts of the world. So again, this Cold War is not so much this giant struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States as it is basically it's a front for the United States to repress any obstacles to the expansion of capitalism around the world, and the lives of humans and other animals, are of no import to them. Next. A great book, Washington Bullets, in which Vijay Prashad basically is a great summary statement, and he talks about these amazing people who were executed, assassinated because of their stands, standing up for the people of the world and the people in their countries and resisting U.S. imperialism. Next. And then Jimmy Carter, when there was a revolution in Afghanistan, the United States didn't like it, and they saw this as an opportunity to try to weaken the Soviet Union. So they funded this proxy war against the Soviet Union, funding all of this money to the Mujahideen that went on after the Soviets finally retreated to become the Taliban. Again, horrible violence against humans and other animals, and the CIA teaching how to use donkeys as the equivalent of camels and as the equivalent of car bombs. Just terrible violence. And against the legacy of this Cold War policy, again, especially right now with the Taliban, is obvious. But again, it was all in the name of controlling the Cold War. Next. Okay, so the Soviet Union is driven down. And so Naomi Klein, amongst others, says, okay, now there doesn't have to be a pretense anymore, even around the world, even within the United States, because there's no alternative. So now capitalism can just go, nothing in the way of capitalism now. And we've seen that. Next. Thank you, Mark. So here comes Clinton. So there's Woodrow Wilson's, he was very overt with the U.S. intention. And then here comes Bill Clinton basically saying the same thing after the fall of the Soviet state in the late 20th century. And then, of course, Clinton is promoting all these free trade neoliberal programs while he is also massively cutting social services and ushering in the militarization of police and mass incarceration in the United States. Next. And then here comes the Bush administration and this terrible, destructive war on Afghanistan and on Iraq, and then it spreads into Syria and into Yemen. And the U.S. is basically, international law basically has meant very little to the United States if it got in the way of the capitalist expansion. And it clearly didn't mean anything for the Bush administration, didn't mean anything to Biden. It certainly doesn't mean anything now to the Trump administration. Next. So according to many scholars and military leaders in the United States, what was going on in this deadly war in Ukraine basically is a whereas the Carter administration led that proxy war to try to weaken the Soviet Union, this is Biden's attempts to push back the growing power of Russia, and not just Russia, but also the developments of the alternative global economic system, BRICS, Russia and China and Brazil and India, that could pose a challenge to U.S. economic hegemony. This helps to explain all of this death and destruction that's going on there. And of course, they knew that Biden's pushing NATO right up, and it was going to provoke Putin. They knew it. Next. And then here's the ongoing genocide and against the Palestinians. That is horrific. Again, and the U.S. doesn't care. The U.S. didn't care when they got behind a deadly coup in Indonesia that led to the deaths of nearly 1 million people. U.S. stood by Indonesia when Indonesia committed genocide in East Timor. U.S. doesn't care. Again, this is all in the name of advancing U.S. global domination, and in this case, the support for the Israeli state and their own deadly colonization taking place there, because the Israeli state is a powerful junior partner for the United States as the world is going into this period of declining resources in the race for what's left. Next. Thank you, Mark. So there, quite a bit has been written about this, but this has been terrible for humans, this Cold War, and then consequent U.S. War on terrorism. And so it's been horrible in a couple of ways. Horrible in that all of this war and destruction is horrible for humans and other animals. Beating back, pushing back all of these alternative economic systems allow the capitalism to go without any obstacles, which means the growing intensive oppression of other animals. And then it also means that so many people around the world are struggling and deprived and traumatized that it doesn't create much of an opportunity for people to respond collectively to the injustice, including that of other animals. Thanks. Next. Sorry for that image, but it's very interesting to me that you'll see some people are writing about this, but they never mention the U.S. specifically or U.S. capitalism, and they certainly don't talk about the U.S. Cold War policy and foreign policy that's promoted all of this. Next. So all the horrible consequences, ecological destruction, mass extinction, a horrific decline of the free living other inhabitants of the world, global poverty, and severe increases in the terrible distribution of wealth and income. So, and then to quote at the bottom, when you've got all these other people struggling around the world, it's hard to get people to get their minds around or even engage in struggling in the interests of other animals. Again, one of the legacies of the Cold War. Next. So within the United States, the people in the United States, because socialists and communists were repressed and pushed down, and there was no mass movement in the United States to speak for the interests of people, then both Democrat and Republican parties are the servants of Wall Street, and the implications for people in the United States have been devastating. Enormous maldistribution of wealth and income in the United States. 3 men in the United States now control more wealth than half the population, and they're all 3 seated behind Trump. So within the United States, again, as people around the rest of the world being so ravaged by capitalism, again, so many people here, they don't know too much about what's happening in Gaza. They don't know too much about what's happening in the rest of the world. They don't know too much about what's happening to other animals. Most of them are simply struggling in the day-to-day struggle to try to make their house payments and insurance payments and such. Next. Thank you, Mark. And so the U.S. moved into the war on terror, but they never left behind the horrors of socialism, right? So they continue to push that anti-socialist, because they don't want people to think about that, to move in that direction, especially when Bernie Sanders collected so much interest, especially amongst young people, when he ran for the presidency in the Democratic primary a few years ago. They have to make sure that they've got the anti-communist hysteria alive and well in the United States. Next. And of course, Donald Trump is all about this. Next. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I don't thoroughly embrace that theory, but I do think there's something to it, especially when you've got people struggling to have their basic needs met and they worry about security, that it reduces the inclination and the possibility that people are going to pull together for justice, for the divide, especially for the divide of the earth, including the other animals. And this is one of the legacies of the U.S. Cold War. That's basically has pushed back these movements for justice around the world. All of these people around the world, from Korea to the Congo, trying to move in a different direction. Next. So again, the problem with socialist and communist countries where they tried, they try to make a go of it, and the tragedies and certain levels of oppression, it's not the natural outcomes of such systems, but basically it's because they were tethered. And I think there's a great parable that in his book, Talik quotes the Brecht's parable about the tailor who built the flying contraption a few centuries ago, and he climbed up to the roof of the church, and then it crashed. And people said people can't fly, but then again, people did. So I guess my point is that it was impossible, right, to get any kind of just democratic socialist communist system off the ground when they were tethered from the start. Next. And so socialists and communists have been vilified, but here in the United States, some scholars say the socialists and communists in the United States in the early part of the 20th century, they were doing terrific work. They were pushing for civil rights. They were pushing for workers' rights. They were pushing for justice for everybody. And this is one of the reasons, right, that they had to be vilified, and there was such anti-communist, anti-socialist hysteria in the United States that, again, has a powerful hold on the public consciousness to this day. Next. So, but you see possibilities, and when Bolivia went socialist, and you saw their creation of the law of the rights of Mother Earth. However, the implementation of that law itself has been tethered by continued U.S. Interference and attempts to undermine attempts for democracy and justice in South America. Next. And then in Kerala, the state in India, again, after decades of organizing, of communists and leftists, they have attained a quality of life that's much better than the rest of India and many parts of the world. And you see in that context this growing movement for animal rights. So again, I have suggested in my work, next, thank you, Mark, that the possibility for justice for everybody and to try to ameliorate, if not abolish, this entangled oppression, the path forward has to include this movement away from capitalism and toward a democratic, people's-controlled form of communist social system. That's the only way forward. Capitalism is just destructive, and that was part and parcel of the whole Cold War disastrous undertaking. That, again, the effects, control the earth to this day. Okay, I think that's it, Mark. Thank you very much for your help there.
Yep, thank you, David, for this remarkable and incredible presentation. And we have a little time for questions. Yeah, we have several in the Zoom chat. I can read them for you, or you can read them yourself.
Yeah. Would you mind reading them, Mark? I'm sorry.
Okay. So thank you in advance, David. I was wondering if there are any explicit connections between U.S. Cold War policies and conservation laws of the time. As far as I know, much of the conservation laws have to do with hunters' lobbies, etc. But maybe there is something more to it in a sense of U.S. animal law back then.
Yeah, the hunters' lobby in the United States is very powerful. There's even within the United States Congress a caucus. And that caucus, amongst other things, the hunters, they don't want any gun control, by the way. So that congressional caucus even blocks any form of gun control in the United States. Yeah, but these conservation laws in the United States, I mean, they're bogus. I mean, they weren't created for in the interest of animals. They were basically created. They were racist from the start. They were excluding indigenous peoples and other peoples of color, and basically trying to basically serve as a system of creating so-called game so that future hunters of elite status, could enjoy recreating by killing other animals. So the Cold War is kind of on par ideologically, politically, economically with the so-called conservation laws, at least as they operate in the United States. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks. And we have another question. So today is National Cosmonaut Day here in Russia. As far as I know, Americans never used dogs in space programs and blamed Soviet Union for cruelty against dogs like Laika and about 50 other dogs. Could you comment if there is any story for the animals employed in exploring space in the USA?
No, they're totally ignored. I mean, their exploitation and oppression, just like every other industry, doesn't get any notice here. I mean, they're just regarded as things and as job objects and as commodities. So there's no recognition, as far as the public is concerned. A lot of the public don't even know about what's happened here. So yeah.
Okay, here's another one. With the expansion of USS power, I suppose its animal AG practices like huge forest operations were imposed on other parts of the world. Could you please comment on that?
Yeah, so these animal operations, in probably the most horrible of these growing CAFOs, and increasing in size and intensity, and with all the implications from, not the least of which is the growing probabilities of more deadly pandemic diseases. I mean, the United States has been promoting this in the Philippines. They've been promoting this throughout Africa. I think Bill Gates in the United States has even invested heavily in CAFOs in Africa and promoted. So the U.S. is just in a struggle now, especially in the face of the growing economic power of India and China, Russia to some extent. Basically in this race for what's left. Claim the land and resources and put as much of that political economic power in the hands of U.S. capitalists as they can. But this is just part and parcel of this ongoing global exploitation and plundering. And the capitalists are going to stuff their pockets, unless there's a collective movement of people around the world, they're going to run the bus, right over the abyss.
Okay, so another question. What do you think the influence of new tariffs on China on animals will be?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
What do you think the influence of new tariffs on China on animals will be?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't. You mean on U.S. sending other animals or products of other animals to China, for example? I'm not sure. I really doubt if it's going to undermine in any significant way this ongoing oppression of other animals. If anything, here in the United States, they'll simply, to maintain profits, they'll reduce prices to basically try to steadily increase the consumption amongst people in the United States. But I don't unfortunately, I don't see in the capitalist dominated world, whether it's U.S. capitalism or the state capitalism in China, of Trump's tariffs, having any impact on the level of oppression of other animals, at least from where I'm sitting now.
Yeah, thank you. And we have another question. So, David, thank you for your presentation. It was really insightful. What do you think about the intentional destruction of animal life in communist states? In China and USSR, they followed the idea of useful animals, and when pigeons were reported to be not of use and even harmful, both states tried to eliminate them, and then they regretted it greatly. And it doesn't mean to me, at least superficially, to be forced by capitalist intentions to oppress communist states. It's like they implemented the communist idea itself in such a bad way. What do you think of it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Again, the countries trying to go communist, they were tethered from the start. So they were constantly under attack by the United States. The Soviet Union, and you all know more about this than I do, had to move toward quick, rapid industrialization where it enabled them to repel German invasion. It had disastrous effects. And so when you have people moving for peace and democracy and they find themselves under attack, whether in the Soviet Union or in China, then unfortunately, you've always got, in those types of situations when there's these threats, you've got men stepping up, and men who are basically programmed with this toxic form of masculinity, hypermasculinity, and it doesn't create much of an atmosphere for pacifists, for people who are more compassionate and more concerned, to step in positions of leadership. It brings to the fore, men who elbow their way to the top because of their aggressiveness and, again, hypermasculinity, and it tends to lead toward, again, many of these policies that disrespect other animals. That if the systems could evolve more naturally and without being hampered, and especially with the input of women, as we see in India, for example, then I think that's the prospect for moving forward. But the United States, again, has just exerted deadly destruction of the world in the last 100 years, to make sure that countries can't move in that direction. And when they do, to hobble their advances toward peace and justice and challenging all forms of oppression.
Yep, thank you. And we have a comment from Susan McHugh. So USA used primates, rhesus monkeys, and chimpanzees in space travel research, and Donna Haraway's book Primate Visions confirms what David said about the animals getting no public acknowledgement, akin to Laika and the other canine cosmonauts. Yeah, and we have a postscriptum. I know that there is a lot of leftists' critique of Evo Morales in Bolivia, and when you were talking about him, it made me think that it is kind of important to underline how the wrongs are not essentially us-led. I mean that maybe it was not the US stopping the development of socialism in Bolivia, even though it is, of course, partially the case, but in the case Morales himself didn't really stand for what he tried to present and just was reinforcing neoliberalism.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. I think, again, when you're under threat from the outside, it tends to lead toward certain repressive policies. When you're trying to develop the country economically, I think that he made some mistakes in the way that he allowed certain forms of exploitation and plundering to go on. And I also think one of the important lessons is that in these movements for socialism, we can't, whether Hugo Chavez in Venezuela or Morales, just everybody stand back and let these people lead. Right? it needs to be a much more collective, democratic, participatory system, and not simply, okay, we've elected, like in the United States, we elect Bernie Sanders to office. If that ever happened, then do we sit back and let Bernie Sanders lead? There'd have to be continual public pressure on Sanders to do the right thing, and I think that's necessary in these other countries as well, because they will get off track. In some cases, they will move in self-serving or ways that's not in the interest of humans or other animals in their country or anywhere else.
Okay, thank you, David. Yeah, and I have a question for you. So maybe do you see any historical movements or moments that offered a meaningful challenge to this entangled oppression? I thought about the move. I think you have heard about it. It's an organization in Philadelphia, and they were influenced by black partners and animal liberation and so on. And yeah, they were anti-communist, and yeah, maybe it's a good example of this fighting against both communist propaganda and against and they try to realize animal liberation movement in reality in this context in the USA.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of what people are trying to do, and then the example of U.S. violence. So the move, the organization in Philadelphia, that they were promoting, black empowerment, black liberation, combining that, with a perspective embracing justice for other animals, and that put them immediately, especially their embrace of justice for other animals and their critiques of the exploitation of animals in zoos and circuses and such. And even what the city of Philadelphia was doing, put them in conflict with the police, and then basically the city of Philadelphia, they bombed they bombed the house that the MOVE members lived in and set fire to, I think, a lot of the neighborhood there. But I mean, that shows the level of unmitigated violence that the U.S. is prepared to wage against people who are trying to move the public consciousness, in a new direction. But again, I think we take strength and courage from those, and we continue, to move forward. And again, if we can get more people around the world, and I think what you're doing right now is very valuable, more people around the world, knowledgeable, aware, organized, I think that's where the future, the real future lies.
Yeah, thank you, David, for the answer. So maybe someone has a question before we wrap up.
Yeah, I just want to say I appreciate so much being with you all. This is really an honor for me. My apologies for my lack of technical skill and the glitches, and my deep appreciation, Mark, for you stepping in and helping me to save my presentation. Much appreciated. And I am really, it's just really wonderful. I mean, it just warms my heart, just to see you all there and look at the great work that you're doing. I think it's just beautiful.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you all for the thoughtful questions and comments. Yeah, and once again, a big thank you again to David for your time and for sharing such valuable insights with us. And we really appreciate your participation in our conference. Yeah, thank you very much.
My honor, a great honor. Thank you.
Yeah, see you.
David.